The truth behind this, 1887. Picture of siblings is darker than anyone believed. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Boston Historical Society's Conservation Lab, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her desk lamp and pulled on a fresh pair of white cotton gloves. She had been restoring Victorian-era photographs for the past month, preparing them for the Society's upcoming exhibition on 19th-century New England family life. Most of the images were predictable: stiff formal portraits, children in elaborate clothing, families arranged by social hierarchy. But this photograph, donated by an estate sale in Salem, immediately caught her attention. 4 children stood in descending height order against a painted backdrop of a garden scene. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 14, stood rigid in a dark suit, his hand resting on the shoulder of a girl around 12. Next to her stood another boy, maybe 10, and finally a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7. All wore formal clothing typical of the 1880s. The inscription on the back read, "The Patterson Children, Salem, Massachusetts, June 1887. Sarah loaded the image into her restoration software, the high-resolution scanner capturing details invisible to the naked eye. She began with routine work, adjusting contrast, checking for tears or water damage, examining the emulsion for deterioration. Then she zoomed in on the children's faces. 3 of them looked normal for the era: serious expressions, clear eyes, healthy complexions despite the sepia tone. But the youngest girl was different. Sarah leaned closer to her monitor, her breath catching. The child's skin had an unnatural pallor, almost translucent. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, so pronounced they looked like bruises. Her lips had a strange sheen, almost metallic, and her eyes. There was something hollow about them, a deadness that went beyond the typical stillness of long-exposure photography. Sarah enhanced the image further, adjusting the shadows and highlights. The more she looked, the more wrong the child appeared. The other 3 children looked uncomfortable but healthy. This little girl looked like she was dying. She checked the documentation again. The Patterson Children, June 1887. No other information. No names, no ages, no context. Sarah's instincts told her something was terribly wrong with this photograph, and she was going to find out what. Sarah couldn't shake the image of that pale child from her mind. She had worked with thousands of Victorian photographs, seen the effects of long exposures and primitive lighting, understood how early photographic processes could distort appearances. But this was different. That little girl didn't just look uncomfortable or tired. She looked genuinely ill. The next morning, Sarah arrived early and went straight to the Massachusetts Vital Records database. She searched for Patterson families in Salem during the 1880s. There were 7 families with that surname living in Salem in 1887, but only one with 4 children of the right approximate ages. Robert Patterson, age 42, merchant, wife Clara, age 38. Children: Henry, 14, Margaret, 12, William, 10, and Eleanor, 7. Eleanor. The youngest child finally had a name. Sarah's next search made her stomach drop. In the Salem Gazette death notices from November 1887, just 5 months after the photograph was taken, she found a brief entry. Eleanor Patterson, beloved daughter of Mr. Robert and Mrs. Clara Patterson, passed into God's care on November 18th. She was 7 years old. After a brief illness, she succumbed to digestive ailment. Services at First Congregational Church. The family requests privacy in their time of mourning. 7 years old, dead 5 months after this photograph. Brief illness and digestive ailment. The vague Victorian euphemisms that could mean almost anything. Sarah pulled up the photograph again, zooming in on Eleanor's face with fresh urgency. She'd read enough about Victorian-era diseases to know what various illnesses looked like. Tuberculosis left people thin and coughing. Scarlet fever caused distinctive rashes. Diphtheria affected the throat visibly, but Eleanor's symptoms were different. The extreme pallor, the dark circles, the strange sheen on her lips. And now that Sarah looked more carefully, she could see something else. The child's hair looked thin and brittle, and there were small dark spots visible on her neck and hands. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Dr. Michael Torres, a medical historian at Harvard who sometimes consulted for the Historical Society. Michael, I need your expertise on Victorian-era illness symptoms. Can you look at a photograph for me? 20 minutes later, Dr. Torres arrived at the lab. Sarah showed him the enhanced images of Eleanor Patterson, pointing out every detail she'd noticed. He studied them in silence for several long minutes, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "Sarah," he said finally, "these aren't symptoms of a natural illness. This child shows classic signs of chronic arsenic poisoning. The pallor, the dark circles, the spots on her skin, the thinning hair, that strange sheen on her lips. It all fits. And if she died of digestive ailment 5 months later, that confirms it. Arsenic poisoning causes severe gastrointestinal symptoms that Victorians often misdiagnosed as natural illness." Sarah felt ice run through her veins. "Are you saying someone was poisoning this child?" "I'm saying that's exactly what this looks like. And in 1887, it happened more often than you'd think, especially when there was insurance money involved." Sarah spent the next 3 days digging through every record she could find about the Patterson family. What emerged was a picture of a family struggling financially despite their middle-class appearance, and a father with a disturbing pattern of behavior. Robert Patterson owned a small dry goods store on Essex Street in Salem, but business records showed it was failing. By 1886, he owed significant debts to several Boston suppliers. The Salem City Directory listed his business, but with increasingly prominent advertisements suggesting desperation, lowest prices in Essex County, and everything must go. Then Sarah found something crucial in the Massachusetts Insurance Commission archives. A life insurance policy taken out on Eleanor Patterson in January 1887, 6 months before the photograph was taken, 11 months before her death. The policy was for $2,000, an enormous sum equivalent to nearly 3 years of a working man's wages. It had been purchased by Robert Patterson through the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company. Sarah contacted an insurance historian who specialized in 19th century policies. $2,000 for a 7-year-old child? The historian said, surprise evident in her voice. That's extremely unusual. Children's policies in that era were typically small, maybe $50 to $100 to cover burial costs. A $2,000 policy on a child suggests either extreme wealth or something more sinister. Many insurance companies were actually starting to refuse large policies on children because they'd been used in so many murder-for-profit cases. Sarah returned to the death records with new focus. Eleanor had died in November 1887. The insurance company had paid out the claim in January 1888. She found the notice in their annual report. $2,000 to Robert Patterson for the death of his youngest daughter. But the story didn't end there. Sarah discovered that Eleanor wasn't Robert Patterson's only child to die young. In 1883, before the family moved to Salem, they had lived in Boston. And in Boston's records, Sarah found another death. Ann Patterson, age 5, died March 1883 of gastric fever. Cause of death, digestive complications. Ann, another daughter, another digestive ailment. And when Sarah requested insurance records from that period, she found another policy, $1,500 on Ann Patterson, purchased 6 months before her death, claimed by Robert Patterson. 2 daughters, both insured for unusual amounts, both dead of mysterious digestive problems, both deaths resulting in significant insurance payouts to a father who was drowning in debt. This wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern. Sarah pulled up the photograph again, looking at it with horror and new understanding. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was documentation of a crime in progress. Eleanor Patterson was being slowly poisoned by her own father, and the photograph had accidentally captured the evidence. The physical symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure visible on her small face for anyone who knew what to look for. The other 3 children stood healthy beside their dying sister, almost certainly unaware of what was happening. Margaret's hand rested on Eleanor's shoulder in what might have been a protective gesture. Did the older siblings suspect something was wrong? Or had their father's actions been so carefully concealed that even they didn't understand why Eleanor was always sick? Sarah knew she needed to find out if there were any surviving descendants of the Patterson family. Someone needed to know the truth about what had happened to Eleanor and Anne, and whether their father had faced any consequences for what he'd done. Finding living descendants proved surprisingly easy. Sarah hired a professional genealogist who traced the Patterson line forward through city records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records. Within a week, she had a family tree spanning 6 generations. Henry Patterson, the oldest boy in the photograph, had survived to adulthood, married, and had 3 children. His line continued through his daughter Ruth, whose great-granddaughter, Jennifer Patterson, lived in Marblehead, just a few miles from Salem. She was 68 years old and, according to social media, actively interested in family history. Sarah called her, carefully explaining that she was researching a historical photograph for an exhibition. Jennifer invited her over that same afternoon. Jennifer's home was filled with antiques and family heirlooms. She led Sarah to a sitting room where old photographs lined the walls. "I've always been fascinated by family history," Jennifer explained, pouring tea. "My grandfather, Henry, named after his grandfather, the Henry in your photograph, used to tell stories about the old Salem house, though he was born years after they'd left it." Sarah showed her the photograph. Jennifer studied it carefully, her expression softening. "I've never seen this one. Look how young they all are. That's my great-great-grandfather Henry, great-great-aunt Margaret, great-great-uncle William, and—" She paused, frowning. "Who's the little girl? I don't recognize her from the family tree." "That's Eleanor," Sarah said gently. "She died in 1887, 5 months after this photo was taken. She was 7 years old." Jennifer's face paled. "Eleanor? I've never heard of an Eleanor. There's no Eleanor in any family records I've seen." "Are you sure?" Sarah showed her the death certificate, the insurance policy, the newspaper obituary. Jennifer stared at the documents in shock. "How is this possible? Why wouldn't she be in the family records? Why has no one ever mentioned her?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," Sarah said. "But Jennifer, there's something else. Something difficult." She explained her findings, the insurance policies, the suspicious deaths, the symptoms visible in the photograph, the medical historian's assessment of arsenic poisoning. Jennifer set down her teacup with shaking hands. "You're telling me my great-great-great-grandfather murdered his own daughters for insurance money?" "The evidence strongly suggests it," Sarah said carefully. "I found records of 2 daughters, Eleanor and an earlier daughter named Anne, both dying of similar symptoms, both heavily insured, both deaths resulting in large payouts to your ancestor." Jennifer stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down an old leather-bound journal. "My grandfather gave me this before he died. It was his father's diary, so Henry's son. I've read through it several times, but there's a section I never quite understood." She flipped through pages. "Here. This was written in 1924, when he was an old man. Mother spoke today of the sisters who were lost. She would never tell me their names, said it was too painful, that father had forbidden any mention of them after we left Salem. She wept and said some secrets die with a generation, and perhaps that's for the best. But I saw in her eyes a grief that went beyond ordinary loss, a shame that had marked her entire life." Sarah felt chills run down her spine. "Margaret knew. Your great-great-aunt Margaret knew something was wrong, and she carried that knowledge her entire life. She was 12 years old in this photograph," Jennifer whispered, looking at Margaret's solemn face. "Old enough to notice if her little sister was sick. Old enough to wonder why she died so suddenly. Maybe old enough to suspect the truth, but powerless to do anything about it." Sarah's discovery of Margaret's knowledge changed everything. If Margaret had suspected the truth, she might have left some record, a diary, letters, some testimony that could confirm what the medical evidence suggested. With Jennifer's help, Sarah began tracking down any documents Margaret might have left behind. Margaret Patterson had married in 1895 and moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where she lived until her death in 1952. She had 2 daughters, both of whom had passed away, but one had donated her mother's personal papers to the Rhode Island Historical Society in 1958. Sarah made the drive to Providence with a sense of urgency. The archivist brought out 3 boxes of Margaret's belongings, letters, household documents, photographs, and a small locked diary. "We've never forced the lock," the archivist explained. "It seemed disrespectful, but you're welcome to try if it's relevant to your research." The diary was bound in faded blue leather, about the size of Sarah's hand. With the archivist's permission, Sarah carefully worked the small lock with a thin tool until it clicked open. Inside, the pages were filled with Margaret's careful handwriting, dated entries spanning from 1895 to 1901. Most entries were mundane: household management, social calls, her children's milestones. But in March 1899, Sarah found something that made her hands tremble. "Samuel asked me today why I never speak of my childhood in Salem. I told him what I always tell people, that those years are painful, that my father died young, that I prefer to look forward rather than back. But the truth, which I can only write here where no one will read it, is that I am haunted by memories I cannot share. I was 12 years old when Eleanor died. I watched her sicken over months, the color draining from her face, her hair thinning, her constant stomach pains that Mother said were just a delicate constitution. I remember thinking how strange it was that Eleanor was always worse after Father prepared her special meals, the ones he said would help her digestion. I remember finding the white powder in Father's desk drawer and asking him what it was. He told me it was medicine for his own stomach troubles and slapped me for going through his things. I remember Mother's face the morning we found Eleanor dead. Not surprised, but resigned, as though she'd been expecting it. We buried her quickly. Father collected money from an insurance company. And then we never spoke her name again. I was forbidden to mention her, forbidden to mourn her publicly, forbidden to tell anyone I'd ever had a sister named Eleanor. When I grew old enough to understand what arsenic poisoning looked like, when I learned that white powders could kill, I finally understood what I'd witnessed. My father murdered my little sister for money, and everyone in the family knew and said nothing. I have carried this knowledge for 12 years, and I will carry it to my grave. But perhaps, in writing it here, I can find some small measure of peace. Sarah sat frozen, the diary open in her lap. Margaret had known. She had witnessed it happening. She had been forced into silence by her father and complicit family, and the guilt had haunted her for decades. There was more. In an entry from 1900, Margaret wrote about Anne, the sister who had died before they moved to Salem. "I was only 8 when Anne died, too young to understand. But I remember Father taking out another insurance policy, remember him bringing home money afterward, remember Mother crying in her room while Father celebrated our good fortune. Now I understand that Eleanor wasn't the first. Anne was. Perhaps there were others before I was born. How many daughters did Father sacrifice for his debts?" Sarah carefully photographed every relevant page of Margaret's diary. Here was the testimony she needed, a first-hand account from someone who had witnessed the crime, understood its nature, and had been powerless to stop it or speak about it. But Margaret's words raised another disturbing question. Where was Clara, the mother? What role had she played? Sarah returned to Salem with Margaret's diary entries weighing heavily on her mind. The question of Clara Patterson's role became increasingly urgent. Was she a victim of her husband's violence, too terrified to speak? Or was she complicit in the murders of her own daughters? The answer came from an unexpected source: court records from 1895, 8 years after Eleanor's death. Sarah found them while searching through Essex County legal archives for any Patterson family documents. In June 1895, Clara Patterson had filed for legal separation from Robert Patterson, an extremely rare action for a woman in that era, requiring substantial cause and social courage. The petition was brief but damning. Clara Patterson seeks legal separation from husband Robert Patterson on grounds of cruelty, threats to her life, and fear for the safety of her remaining children. The petition included testimony from Clara herself, given before a judge in closed proceedings. Sarah found the sealed transcript in the archives marked confidential, but now, more than a century later, available for research. Clara's testimony was devastating. "I have lived in fear for 13 years. In 1883, my husband insured our daughter Anne for $1,500. 6 months later, Anne became ill with stomach troubles. My husband insisted on preparing all her meals himself, saying he had special medicines to help her digestion. She died within 2 months. I suspected nothing then. I believed it was tragic misfortune. But in 1887, Robert insisted we insure Eleanor for $2,000. I protested. It seemed wrong to place such value on a child's life. He became violent, threatening me if I didn't cooperate. 6 months after the policy was issued, Eleanor began having the same symptoms Anne had suffered, the same sudden illness, the same stomach pains, the same meals prepared exclusively by Robert. I confronted him. I said Eleanor's illness seemed suspicious. He told me if I spoke a word to anyone, he would kill me and make it look like an accident, and then he would collect insurance on me too. I watched my daughter die, knowing what was happening, too terrified to stop it. After Eleanor's death, Robert became bolder. He suggested we insure our son William. I refused. He beat me severely. That was when I knew I had to leave, had to protect my surviving children, even if it meant public shame and financial ruin. The judge had granted Clara's separation on grounds of extreme cruelty. Robert Patterson was ordered to provide minimal financial support, but had no contact with his remaining children. Clara had taken Henry, Margaret, and William to Boston, where they lived in poverty, but alive. Sarah found more records. Robert Patterson had died in 1897, just 2 years after the separation, from what was listed as heart failure at age 52. But there was a note in the coroner's report that caught Sarah's attention. Deceased found to have abnormally high levels of arsenic in his system, uncertain if exposure was accidental or intentional. Someone had poisoned Robert Patterson. Given the amount of arsenic found in his body, it had been accumulating for months, the same slow poisoning he had inflicted on his daughters. Sarah sat back, stunned. Had Clara finally gotten her revenge? Or had one of the other children, maybe Henry, old enough by 1897 to understand what his father had done, taken justice into their own hands? She returned to Margaret's diary, looking for entries from 1897. There was only one, dated November of that year. Father is dead. I should feel grief, but I feel only relief. Whatever circumstances led to his death, I cannot mourn him. Some men deserve the fate they receive. Mother will not speak of it, but I see in her eyes a peace that has been absent for years. We are finally free. The truth was becoming clear. Robert Patterson had murdered at least 2 of his daughters for insurance money, terrorized his wife into silence, and ultimately died by the same method he had used on his victims. And his family, traumatized and bound by shame, had erased the murdered children from their history, choosing collective amnesia over public scandal. With Jennifer's permission and encouragement, Sarah expanded her investigation to determine if there were other victims beyond Anne and Eleanor. If Robert Patterson had successfully murdered 2 daughters for insurance money, it seemed possible, even likely, that he might have attempted it before. Sarah returned to Boston's vital records, tracking the Patterson family back before their time in Salem. What she found was chilling. Robert and Clara Patterson had married in 1872 in Boston. Their first child, a daughter named Mary, was born in 1873. Mary died in 1878 at age 5 from sudden digestive failure. Sarah requested insurance records from that period and found a $500 policy on Mary, purchased 6 months before her death. A second daughter, Catherine, was born in 1875 and died in 1881 at age 6, also from gastric complications. Another insurance policy, $800 this time. Henry, the first son and oldest child in the photograph, was born in 1873, Margaret in 1875, William in 1877. All 3 had survived to adulthood. Then came Anne in 1878, dead by 1883. Catherine in 1880, dead by 1886. And finally, Eleanor in 1880, dead by 1887. The pattern was unmistakable and horrific. Robert Patterson had fathered 7 children. He had systematically murdered 4 daughters, Mary, Catherine, Anne, and Eleanor, all for insurance money, all using the same method, all between the ages of 5 and 7. The 3 surviving children were all boys or Margaret, who had been kept alive perhaps because she was old enough to be useful for household labor. Sarah created a timeline, and the calculated nature of the crimes became even clearer. Each murder was preceded by a 6-month waiting period after the insurance policy was purchased, just long enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Each was executed slowly, over weeks or months, mimicking natural illness. And each time, Robert Patterson had walked away with insurance money that temporarily relieved his financial troubles, until his debts mounted again and he needed another victim. The total take, approximately $5,800 across 4 murders, equivalent to nearly 15 years of middle-class income. Robert Patterson had essentially funded his failing business with his daughters' lives. Sarah scheduled another meeting with Jennifer, this time bringing the complete documentation. Jennifer arrived with 2 of her cousins, other descendants of Henry Patterson who had heard about the investigation and wanted to know the truth about their family history. Sarah laid out everything: the photographs, the insurance policies, the death certificates, the medical evidence, Clara's testimony, Margaret's diary, and the timeline showing 4 murdered children across 14 years. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Jennifer spoke, her voice thick with emotion. 4 little girls. 4 of my ancestors murdered by their own father, erased from family memory because the shame was too great. They deserved better. They deserved to be remembered. One of the cousins, a woman named Patricia, wiped tears from her eyes. My grandmother, Henry's granddaughter, used to say there was sadness in the bloodline, that the family carried some unnamed grief. I always thought she was being dramatic. Now I understand. The survivors carried the knowledge of what had been done, and the guilt of their silence, and they passed that trauma down through generations even when the specific story was forgotten. Sarah pulled out the photograph of the 4 Patterson children, now understanding its full meaning. This image was taken in June 1887, probably for the insurance company as documentation that Eleanor existed and was healthy. But it accidentally captured something else, the visible evidence of her poisoning, there in her face for anyone who knew what to look for. And more than that, it captured a moment when all 4 surviving children were still alive, before Robert Patterson murdered his 4th victim. Jennifer touched the photograph gently. They're all victims. Eleanor died. But Margaret, Henry, and William had to live with what they'd witnessed, what they'd been powerless to stop. That's its own kind of death. Sarah knew this story needed to be told, but she also understood the ethical complexity of exposing a family's darkest secrets, especially when descendants were still alive and had played no role in the crimes. She met with Dr. Rebecca Chen, the Historical Society's director, to discuss how to present the findings. This is important historical work, Dr. Chen said after reviewing all the documentation. It illuminates how insurance fraud murders were a real phenomenon in the 19th century, how domestic violence was hidden behind respectable facades, how entire families could be traumatized into silence. But we need to do this carefully and respectfully. Sarah had already discussed the exhibition with Jennifer and the other Patterson descendants. To her surprise, they had been unanimous in their support. These children deserve to be remembered, Jennifer had said firmly, not as shameful secrets, but as victims who were failed by every system that should have protected them. If telling their story can help people understand how abuse and violence hide behind normal appearances, then it's worth the discomfort. Working with Jennifer's input, Sarah developed an exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight: Insurance Fraud, Murders, and Family Violence in Victorian America. The centerpiece was the 1887 photograph of the Patterson children, displayed both in its original form and with digital enhancement, highlighting Eleanor's symptoms of arsenic poisoning. The exhibition included careful documentation, the insurance policies, death certificates, medical analysis explaining the symptoms, excerpts from Margaret's diary, portions of Clara's court testimony, and historical context about the widespread problem of insurance fraud murders in the 19th century. Sarah wrote the interpretive text to balance honesty with sensitivity. Between 1873 and 1887, Robert Patterson of Boston and Salem murdered at least 4 of his daughters, Mary, Catherine, Anne, and Eleanor, by slowly poisoning them with arsenic to collect life insurance payouts. This photograph, taken in June 1887, shows his 4 surviving children. The youngest, Eleanor, displays visible symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning, evidence that went unrecognized at the time. She would die 5 months later. Her 3 siblings survived but were traumatized into silence, forbidden from speaking about their murdered sisters. This case represents a larger Victorian-era phenomenon, the insurance murder epidemic that led to significant reforms in how life insurance policies on children were regulated. The exhibition opened on a cold February evening. Sarah stood near the Patterson display, watching visitors' reactions. Many people stopped in shocked silence before the photographs. Parents pulled their children closer. Some visitors read Margaret's diary excerpts with tears streaming down their faces. Jennifer attended the opening with 7 other Patterson family members, spanning 3 generations. They stood together before the display showing their ancestors. "It's strange," Jennifer said quietly to Sarah. "For so long these children were hidden, their stories erased. Now they're finally visible. Finally remembered. Finally getting the truth told about what was done to them." A reporter from the Boston Globe interviewed Sarah about the exhibition. The resulting article, "Victorian-Era Serial Killer Hid Behind Respectable Facade," generated significant media attention. Insurance historians contacted Sarah to discuss how cases like Patterson's had led to reforms in life insurance practices. True crime podcasters requested interviews. Medical historians wanted to use the case in teaching about historical poisoning methods and symptom recognition. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source: a child welfare advocate who specialized in recognizing signs of abuse. "This historical case is incredibly relevant today," she told Sarah. "We still see cases where children are harmed for financial gain, insurance fraud, benefits fraud, inheritance schemes. And we still see families staying silent out of shame or fear, teaching people to recognize signs of abuse, to question situations that seem off, to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. That's as important now as it was in 1887. Sarah realized the Patterson children's story had become more than historical documentation. It had become a tool for education and awareness, a reminder that evil often hides behind ordinary facades, and that silence protects perpetrators while condemning victims to be forgotten. 3 months after the exhibition opened, Sarah received a letter forwarded from the Historical Society. It was from a woman named Dorothy Martin, age 91, living in a nursing home in Worcester. The letter was written in shaky but clear handwriting. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, I saw the newspaper article about your exhibition on the Patterson family. I believe I have information you need. My grandmother was Clara Patterson's sister, making me Clara's great-niece. Before she died in 1956, my grandmother told me stories about her sister that the family had kept secret for decades. She said Clara had tried to stop what was happening, but was trapped by the laws and customs of the time. She also told me there was a 5th daughter who was murdered, one that happened before the family kept any records. If you want to know the full truth, please come visit me. I'm old, and I want to tell someone before I die. Some secrets have been buried too long." Sarah drove to Worcester the next day. Dorothy was waiting in the nursing home's common room, a folder of old papers on her lap. Despite her age, her mind was sharp and her memory detailed. "My grandmother was Emma, Clara's younger sister," Dorothy began. "She was close to Clara and watched her sister's marriage become a nightmare. What your exhibition shows is true, but it's not complete. There was another daughter, the first. Her name was Julia, born in 1872, died in 1877 at age 5. That was Robert's first murder, his test case. He insured her for just $300, which seemed reasonable. When she died of natural causes, he got away with it completely. No one suspected anything. That success emboldened him to try again with Mary, then Catherine, then Anne, then Eleanor." Dorothy pulled out a photograph from her folder, an image Sarah had never seen. It showed 2 women, clearly sisters. That's Clara on the left, Emma on the right, taken around 1890, after Clara had escaped Robert. See Clara's face? She looks haunted because she was. Emma told me that Clara had tried to get help multiple times. She'd gone to the police in 1883 after Anne died, but they dismissed her concerns because Robert was a respected merchant. She'd tried to talk to their family doctor, but he said she was being hysterical. She'd even tried to refuse to cooperate with the insurance policies, and Robert had beaten her so severely she couldn't walk for a week. Dorothy's hands trembled as she continued. The worst part, Emma said, was that Clara knew what was happening by the time Eleanor was murdered. She knew, and she felt powerless to stop it. She watched her daughter die slowly day by day, knowing exactly what Robert was doing. The guilt destroyed her. Even after she finally escaped, even after Robert died, Clara never forgave herself. She died in 1920, and Emma said her last words were, "I should have saved them." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. She tried. She did try. Yes, but in that era, a woman's testimony against her husband was worth nothing, especially when he was a respected businessman. The system failed Clara as completely as it failed her daughters. And here's something else Emma told me. After Robert died in 1897, and yes, Emma confirmed that Clara had slowly poisoned him over 6 months using his own arsenic supply, Clara used the small amount of money she had to create a private memorial. She couldn't speak publicly about her murdered daughters, so she had 5 small stones carved and placed in an unmarked section of Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. One for each girl: Julia, Mary, Catherine, Anne, and Eleanor. No names on the stones, just the years they were born and died. Emma took me there once when I was a teenager. I can tell you exactly where they are. Sarah drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery that afternoon. With Dorothy's directions, she found the section, a quiet corner beneath old oak trees. There, in a small cluster, were 5 modest granite stones, weathered by more than a century of seasons. No names, just dates: 1872, 1877, 1873, 1878, 1875, 1881, 1878, 1883, 1880, 1887. 5 daughters, 5 lives stolen, 5 children finally, secretly mourned by a mother who couldn't save them but refused to let them be completely forgotten. Sarah photographed the stones and added them to the exhibition with Dorothy's permission. Now the story was complete. 5 murdered children, 1 traumatized mother who had tried and failed to protect them, 3 surviving siblings who carried the trauma for life, and finally, 130 years later, the full truth revealed. The discovery of Clara's secret memorial transformed the exhibition from an exposé of historic crimes into something more profound, a story of mothers and children, of powerlessness and resistance, of trauma and remembrance. Sarah worked with Jennifer and Dorothy to organize a memorial service at Mount Auburn Cemetery. They invited all the Patterson descendants they could locate, along with representatives from child advocacy organizations, historians, and members of the public who had been moved by the exhibition. On a sunny May morning, almost exactly 130 years after the photograph of the Patterson children was taken, more than 50 people gathered around those 5 small stones. Jennifer spoke first, her voice steady despite her emotion. "We're here today to remember 5 children who were murdered by their father and erased from family history. Julia, Mary, Catherine, Anne, and Eleanor Patterson. For more than a century, they were hidden. Not because they deserved to be forgotten, but because their deaths caused shame and pain that seemed too great to speak about. Today we break that silence. We say their names. We acknowledge what was done to them. And we promise that they will be remembered not as shameful secrets, but as children who deserved better from every adult and every institution that should have protected them." Dorothy, now in a wheelchair but determined to attend, added her own words. "My great-aunt Clara lived with unbearable guilt because she couldn't save her daughters. But she tried. She went to the police. She tried to refuse the insurance policies. She finally escaped and saved her remaining children. And she created this memorial when she couldn't speak publicly. She did what she could within the constraints of her time. We honor her courage too, and we recognize that she was as much a victim of the system that enabled Robert Patterson as her daughters were." Sarah spoke about the broader significance. This story matters not just as history, but as a reminder. It reminds us that abuse and violence often hide behind respectable appearances. It reminds us that children can be victimized by the very people who should protect them. It reminds us that systems, legal, medical, social, can fail catastrophically when they prioritize the reputations of powerful men over the safety of vulnerable children. And it reminds us that silence protects abusers while condemning victims to be forgotten. We have to look closely. We have to ask difficult questions. We have to listen when someone says they need help, even if, especially if, it's uncomfortable or challenges our assumptions about respectable families. After the ceremony, workers installed a new memorial stone, purchased through donations from exhibition visitors. It was larger than the others, placed at the center of the 5 small markers. The inscription read, "In memory of Julia, Mary, Catherine, Anne, and Eleanor Patterson daughters, murdered 1877-1887, and their mother Clara, who tried to save them, some stories must be told so they never happen again." The exhibition continued to travel to other cities: New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. Each venue added local context about insurance fraud murders in their own regions, finding similar cases that had been hidden in archives. The pattern was clear. Robert Patterson wasn't unique. He was part of a widespread problem that had led to significant reforms in insurance practices by the early 1900s. Sarah continued researching Victorian-era family violence, finding more cases, more victims, more stories that needed to be told. But the Patterson children remained central to her work, their photograph serving as the most powerful piece of evidence she'd ever encountered. An image that seemed innocent on its surface but revealed terrible truth when examined closely. 1 year after the exhibition opened, Sarah returned to Mount Auburn Cemetery alone. She stood before the memorial stones, thinking about all the documents she'd read, all the descendants she'd met, all the people who had been moved by this story. The photograph that had started everything was now in the Historical Society's permanent collection, displayed with full context about what it revealed. Those 4 children, Henry, Margaret, William, and Eleanor, posed together in 1887, captured in a moment when all 4 were still alive. Within months, Eleanor would be dead. The 3 survivors would carry trauma and secrets for the rest of their lives, and their murdered sisters would be erased from family memory for more than a century. But now, finally, all 5 were remembered. Their names were known, their stories were told, and their deaths meant something beyond just tragedy. They had become part of the historical record that helped people understand how abuse functioned, how it was hidden, and why it was crucial to look beyond comfortable appearances to see what was really happening. Sarah placed 5 white roses on the memorial stone, 1 for each murdered child. "You're not forgotten," she said quietly. "You're not hidden anymore. And maybe, because your story is known now, another child somewhere will be protected. Another voice will be heard. Another truth will be believed." The photograph that looked innocent, 4 siblings posed formally in 1887, had revealed something darker than anyone believed. But in revealing that darkness, it had also illuminated the importance of looking closely, questioning carefully, and refusing to let victims remain invisible. The Patterson children's silence was broken, and in breaking it, Sarah had helped ensure that their deaths, more than a century ago, might still save lives today.